A South Korean trade delegation is in the U.S. for more technical talks on tariffs this week as it seeks to set a productive stage for a mutually beneficial deal once the political transition here at home is complete. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, May 21st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we revisit the Trump administration's trade policy and its broader implications as a delegation of Korean officials are in the U.S. for more technical discussions on tariffs. For this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, as always, welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
I also have freelance journalist David Cox live on the line over in the UK. David, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be back on the show.
Right. Here in the studio, we will start. Steven, so the Korean trade delegation is over in the U.S. following threats of full reciprocal tariffs by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on American trade partners who do not negotiate, and I'm quoting, in good faith. Let's start with these remarks and their implications.
Well, basically what it appears as though Bessent is doing is depicting the current step back from the 25% blanket tariffs as a kind of temporary reprieve that is contingent on what he said of the U.S.'s negotiating partners as operating in good faith. There's a few things we could say here. I think it's important to note that he did not specify what exactly he meant by negotiating in good faith. The generally accepted definition of what it means to negotiate in good faith is that you do not promise things that you don't intend to follow through on, that you consider the other side's position, that you make an earnest effort to come to an amicable agreement. I think by all indications, we can safely assume that the South Korean side would be operating in accordance with those principles. These are all professional negotiators, and they have a long-standing alliance and relationship of mutual respect with the United States. But I mean, the kind of risk is that, as I alluded to earlier, Bessent did not say what exactly would amount to operating in good faith and on what basis Washington could later accuse South Korea or any other negotiating partner of having not operated in good faith. It's a kind of unfalsifiable claim. It's kind of subjective. And that is hanging over these talks. I mean, the kind of good side, the indication of possible positive momentum is that these are more detailed talks that are a kind of follow-up to some kind of exploratory discussions that took place between officials from the two sides at the APEC meeting in Jeju Island last week. And so I believe some of the things that they want to discuss are balanced trade, non-tariff measures, economic security, digital trade, and a few other things. And I guess what they will be endeavoring to do is seeing potential areas of overlap and where the two sides can complement each other. I mean, the kind of risky subtext of this is that there is also the possibility that the Trump administration is really what their motivation is maybe they are not operating in good faith themselves. Maybe they are really just seeking to squeeze concessions from the South Korean side. We don't really know. So we'll have to wait and see what they come up with.
Right. Speaking about what the Trump administration wants from South Korea, CNBC claims that Mr. Trump is seeking a one-stop shopping deal with South Korea, which would come at a cost. First, what is meant by a one-stop shopping deal, and what cost are pundits speaking about?
Well, let's be clear. Trump used that wording himself. This is not this in a post on social media. He said that he wanted a one-stop shopping agreement with South Korea. This is not just something that this was not CNBC's wording. That's important to flag. I mean, it's shopping is a curious choice of words. It does kind of imply that Trump is operating with like a set of objectives in his head, things that he's trying to get, that he maybe sees this as an opportunity to benefit in some way. I think what he was saying was he wants to address the trade relationship with South Korea. He also wants to discuss the issue of the costs of stationing U.S. troops in South Korea. This has been a big thing for him for a long time. I think even before he was president, he was kind of depicting American allies as taking unfair advantage of the U.S. military, and instead of developing their own defense capacity, relying on U.S. troops to keep them safe in their own regions, where the U.S. also has interests, of course. And then Bennett came out and said that this is just kind of the way that he does business. But there's a long distance between this kind of rhetoric and the granular bureaucratic reality according to which these systems function. South Korea and the U.S. have an agreement called an SMA, which governs how they manage the hosting of troops. And they made sure to renew that in November of last year before the new administration in the U.S. took power. And that's good until 2030. And so I've spoken to experts on this, and they've always been careful to caution that Trump cannot just say these things and expect them to happen in an expeditious manner. There's all kinds of legal and bureaucratic hurdles that keep these kinds of systems in place. So Trump is well known as a very transactional kind of guy. He's well known as a showman, as someone who has a flair for coming up with a catchy turn of phrase in front of a camera or online. So we'll have to see just how serious he is about approaching the relationship with South Korea in this way. The other thing, before I wrap up, the other point that I would just conclude is that Trump's major foreign policy objective is dealing with China. And if no one has told him this already, surely he has people in his advisory camp that are going to tell him that the U.S. presence in South Korea is really quite important for maintaining U.S. interests in this part of the world in terms of economic security, in terms of shipping lanes and all the other things that global commerce needs to function. So I do wonder if we might see a continuation of this kind of back and forth strategy where Trump lobs a more aggressively worded statement and then maybe moves back a little bit later as things calm down.
Right, and staying with this particular subject, David, scholars here believe that linking defense costs and trade initiatives may ultimately hurt the credibility of American commitment to security here in this part of the world. Speaking as a journalist, observing the events here from there in Europe, David, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I agree. As Steven said, this has been a favored topic of Trump for some time as part of his America First agenda. He's been banging on about it for kind of quite some time. I mean, it's quite possible that he is just purely kind of posturing, he's kind of playing on the ongoing South Korean insecurities over North Korea. And so, I mean, that's why, he's kind of perhaps bringing this subject up as a means of leverage in ongoing trade talks. But, I think it does definitely still hurt the image of the US across Asia in general. I mean, earlier this year, I think Singapore came out with quite a strongly worded statement saying that the US is starting to be viewed a bit more as a landlord seeking rent rather than the great disruptor it has been in the past. So I think that maybe Trump is perhaps sort of unaware of that a lot of his posturing could, definitely harm America's influence in the region. There's been quite a bit of discussion that the image of the US in Asia has already been deteriorating for a number of years, even before Trump took office. So I think it risks the US being perceived as less credible, less of a sort of a kind of an influential figure in the region. And I think on the other hand, it does risk further strengthening the influence of China across the rest of Asia in general.
David, beyond South Korea's trade talks with the US, the UK was the first to strike a deal with the US. Could you tell us a bit about the deal, the tariff deal signed between the UK and the US, and the response to it by pundits there?
So like everyone, I mean, we've been reeling quite a lot from the tariffs, the great tariff shock, particularly as the UK economy isn't in a great place at the moment. We've got rising inflation, unemployment. We're still feeling the big kind of economic aftermath of COVID. So I think Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, he felt pressure to strike a deal with Trump. And to kind of summarize simply, we've basically struck deals on cars, steel, and beef, while American farmers have been given access to sell food in the UK. That's a major coup for Trump. That's never happened really before. So the Prime Minister here has been bigging up the deal. He claims it will save thousands of jobs. And there are signs that businesses are relieved, particularly the UK car industry, because we export quite a lot of cars to the US. However, in some ways, it's not a great deal. So the US still has like a baseline 10% tariff on UK goods, and that's remaining unchanged. And so because of that, there's a few other pundits who are saying they're not convinced we perhaps should have moved quite so quickly to try and strike a deal with Trump, just especially given how unpredictable he is. So, you know, we've seen in the past that he likes to strike these deals with various countries, and then those deals can be torn up quite quickly. So others think that perhaps we maybe should have prioritized striking deals with other parts of the world. But then again, just given the turmoil in the UK, I think there was quite a bit of pressure to try and get a deal done. So we'll see how this plays out.
In the meantime, David, the Financial Times, it says Beijing has found fault with the tariff deal signed between the UK and the US. Do tell us why, and what has been the response from the British government?
So this all basically comes down to some of these quite key and subtle sub-clauses in this new deal between, let's say, the UK and the US. So basically, the US wants very heavy oversight of the UK's supply chains for products using steel and cars, which we're shipping lots of to the US. And China, who basically make a lot of components, which, for example, go into UK-made cars, they quite rightly suspect that this is a very subtle way from the US of squeezing them out, which would be a huge blow to their industry. And so they're very worried about their involvement just basically becoming a lot limited in UK manufacturing. So they've hit back. Chinese representatives, I think earlier this week, they called the clauses of the deal poison pills and said that they were worse than tariffs. And this has also come at quite a critical time for UK-China relations. So about 10 years ago, like UK-China relations were quite warm, but they've been tense now for a good 5-6 years. But with the UK's economic struggles, the UK has been trying to get a little closer to China. The Chancellor visited Beijing earlier this year, but things have quite markedly deteriorated since then in the last couple of months. So, but last month, the UK government took back control of a steel factory here, which had been owned by the Chinese, and now this deal has happened. So I think any prospect of UK-China relationships sort of starting to warm again is probably quite distant now after what's happened.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Stephen, back here in Korea, following talks with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in Jeju last week, Industry and Trade Minister An Dok-keun claimed that the deadline for a tariff deal with the U.S. was quite tight. Do you share this sentiment?
I would just preface this answer by saying that the situation is quite fluid and things are changing all the time. So this sense of urgency or the sense of time-boundness that negotiators are feeling right now could change just because anything could change with each passing day. If there's one thing that we know about the Trump administration's approach to these tariffs is that they are willing to change them and that they don't have, by any appearances, like a very thoroughly thought out and planned and rigorous approach to all this. They're kind of making decisions as they go along, shall we say. So, but the backdrop of all of this is the domestic fluidity in South Korea, the fact that South Koreans will vote in a presidential election on June 3rd. That will, we don't know exactly, but it could see a change in power. There will definitely be a new government in power, but we don't know if they will be representing one side or the other. And that tends to result in changes to the bureaucracy. It tends to result in differences of vision on the ministerial level and elsewhere. So that's all up in the air. I mean, if I had to, guess as to what the internal thinking in the government is on this right now, is there is a lot of bipartisan consensus in South Korea on the importance of maintaining South Korea's soundness as a successful exporter. And the relationship with the US is a key part of that. So one thing that I cannot imagine the two sides bickering too much over is the need to be able to seamlessly and effectively negotiate with the US. So as to Minister Ah's claim that July 8th is the deadline and that is fixed, I don't know enough about what's happening behind the scenes to comment on the wisdom of adhering to that as a hard and fast deadline. I would advise anybody who's watching this to just bear in mind that this is an issue of great importance to South Korea, and I think they'll do everything they can to reach a favorable result.
Right, of course, as an export-oriented country and economy. David, there have been reports of Mr. Trump's tariff campaign fueling a strong anti-American sentiment in some places. What is the sentiment there in the UK?
Well, I think that I guess the headline is that the special relationship isn't quite so special anymore. I mean, I think I saw some surveys saying that only a third of the UK really believes that we have close ties with the US anymore. I mean, I think a lot of this is just coming from British people, even those who support Trump, just being quite worried that the ongoing tariff situation is going to impact the economy even more and impact their personal finances. We're having like sort of a rising cost of living here, like sort of in the UK, and that has really been the case ever since the Russia-Ukraine war kind of broke out. So that's kind of the backdrop to this. I think probably like perceptions of the US and the UK are still better than in the rest of Europe, but I think we're already seeing, some signs of even boycotts of US products from people who feel particularly strongly about this. I read a New York Times article which kind of said that some people in the UK and Europe were starting to boycott Tesla cars, McDonald's. Some people have even been deleting their subscriptions to Netflix and Disney. So, I mean, I think it's quite a sign that just here in the UK and more broadly across Europe, particularly Denmark with all of Trump's kind of ongoing posturing over Greenland, feelings about the US, kind of aren't what they were, basically.
Right, and staying with this, Stephen, as a Canadian journalist working here in Asia, what can you share with us about the anti-American sentiment over in Canada?
All right, here's where I need to choose my words very carefully. I would say anti-American sentiment is maybe a kind of harsh way of putting it, because I think it's a multifaceted and complex kind of thing. I don't think it's that Canadians are anti-American exactly. Like we're talking about two countries that have arguably the most fruitful and successful mutual trading relationship of any two countries on earth. There are tons of Canadians who work in the United States and who have family in the United States and vice versa. And there's all this interchange. I think what struck a nerve in Canada is there has always been this, I guess I could say, an imbalance in that as the much smaller country, Canadians spend every day of their lives thinking about the United States, whether they want to or not. I grew up watching American television. We listen to American music. We watch American movies. A lot of what our consumer goods in our stores come from the United States. But the average American person does not spend any of their life thinking about Canada, because it is just such a smaller country. And unless you live in the border area, it's just not really on your radar. I mean, it's different now that Canada has had some super high-profile celebrities in the United States. Drake and Justin Bieber and some others have put us on the map. But I remember when I was young going to the United States and telling people that I was from Toronto, which is a pretty big city, and them saying, what state is that in? They'd never heard of it. So there is this sense of Canadians, I think, are quite sensitive to feelings as though they are being condescended to by the US. And so when Trump came out and said that he wanted to make Canada the 51st state, and just failing to recognize Canada as a sovereign and unique place with its own identity that is distinct from the United States, I think that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so that has led to, arguably it flipped the results of the federal election that took place in recent months. You had the Conservatives who looked set to cruise to a fairly easy victory, and that all changed. The Liberals were able to retain their control on the government, and the consensus among analysts was that it was because they took a more, they stood up to the U.S. a little bit more, and then they, kind of channeled this sense that Canada is a unique place that would not be taken over by its much larger neighbor. And now there is, boycotts and all kinds of things like that. I mean, I don't know how long it will last, but the lesson that I would take from this, the lesson that, like, as someone who grew up in Canada, that I would seek to impart to an international audience is that I didn't find any of this surprising, because I'm very well aware of this latent sense of, I mean, I guess you could say it's a little brother complex or something to that effect, like this very acute sense of, like, being in a close relationship with someone who is a lot more powerful than you, and wanting to engage with that partner on a mutually respectful basis. So what we're calling a rise in anti-American sentiment, it's not new, but it is the spike in it is what I think will be a kind of temporary response to a temporary phenomenon, and hopefully sooner than later the two countries can get back to business as usual and get back to the mutually beneficial relationship that they've had.
Hopefully, of course, hopefully.
Yes.
Meanwhile, David, amid these concerns over America's trade policy, I hear the UK and the EU sealed a landmark deal to reset relations post-Brexit. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular deal and its broader implications?
Well, I think this is quite interesting. I mean, I think this is maybe one of the few good things which have come out of the tariff war. They're calling it the big reset here in the UK. It's sort of pushed us and the EU kind of back a little closer together again. Because, obviously, since Brexit, the relationship has never quite been the same, but we've now struck this new deal to work together on security, defense, and various forms of energy trade. The energy aspect is quite big, like in the UK. We've had spiraling energy costs in the last 3 years, ever since that kind of the Russia-Ukraine war broke out. So the UK is now kind of like being reintegrated back into the EU's energy market, and that could be good news for consumers here in terms of hopefully perhaps falling bills again. And obviously, quite crucially, in terms of a broader spectrum, there's this new security and defense partnership, which is a big kind of step forward in rebuilding that relationship between the EU and the UK. So it's quite a wide-ranging deal. It's quite similar to the deal which the EU has signed with Japan and South Korea. And so it's a bit of an opening of the door to kind of cooperation again on a high level between, let's say, the UK and the EU. So, I do think that this is a huge positive, definitely. We're starting to become closer together again, let's say, with the EU for the first time in quite a long time.
All right, and staying with regional efforts then, Stephen, what are the prospects of a similar regional deal on trade among Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing, do you think?
Those are three, big, important countries with, very unique ways of operating internationally. I think on one level, the administrations in all of those countries would like to find ways that would allow them to trade more freely. You also have a lot of variation in, like, the way that each of those countries tends to dominate particular industries. I mean, maybe it will, once we have clarity as to the composure of the government here in Seoul, that might be something that they could look to discuss again. There's definitely a lot to gain, I think, by having some more free movements of goods and of people, maybe having some visa regulations eased. But at the same time, those are three countries with very complicated relationships and history and, some amount of suspicion on certain parts. So it's definitely something that I think the government would look at, but I for one, am not going to hold my breath just yet.
Right. But as you mentioned earlier, pundits are saying cooperation to a great extent would be much better than confrontation here in this part of the world.
As everywhere else.
Right, for sure.
Can't we all just get along?
Right. All right, Stephen, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
And David, over in the UK, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of Press Perspective for today. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow for more panel discussion.